Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for coming inside on this absolutely beautiful evening. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I work here at the Oregon Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and introduce tonight's speaker. I want to tell you that our mission here at the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And we do this work in a wide variety of ways. Public programs like this one, exhibitions like the one that is inspiring tonight's public program, a research library that has a world-class collection and is available for anybody to use at no charge, so just come on in anytime they're open with a research question and they can help you answer that. We have resources for K-12 educators. We have a scholarly journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, that is available for everyone. And we have incredible online resources, the Oregon Encyclopedia, OHS digital collections, our museum portal, and much more. So if you don't already get to know us, please get to know us. And if you do, maybe there's something that you heard about tonight that you didn't know we had, so you can check it out. We're supported by members, by private donors, by foundations, also by the state of Oregon, which usually gives us an appropriation, and also by Multnomah County residents who have 3 times now voted to enact a modest property tax levy. Thank you if you're a Multnomah County resident and taxpayer. We really appreciate that. And one thing to keep in mind is because you pay those property taxes, your admission to the museum is always prepaid. So you never have to pay museum admission when you're a Multnomah County resident. Come in anytime. The work that OHS does is really additive. We are always adding to what we understand about the past. We're never taking things away. We're always learning more, and we're always generating more understanding of that story about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And we can do that work not just because of the financial support of members and private donors and public funding, but also because of the people who reach out to us and decide to trust us with the gifts of their stories and their materials from their families and from their businesses and from parts of their life that are meaningful to them. And the exhibition, The Yasui Family, An American Story, that we opened here just last Friday and will be open until September 2026, that's possible because in 1991, Yasui family members reached out to the Oregon Historical Society and said, "We have these materials from our family history. Are you interested in them?" And the Oregon Historical Society staff at the time said, "Yes, absolutely," and sent vans out to Hood River to pick up materials and set family members up in our warehouse at the time to spend a year going through those materials and gaining a better understanding of them. And it's because of our partnership with the family and because of the family's trust in OHS that we have these materials now that we can put on display, put in our digital history collections, and make available to everyone. Also, I want to point out that the materials, many of the materials that are on display that we understand more about this history is because of research and work that's made possible by an LSTA grant. So those grants that were provided to OHS, some of you may have heard about LSTA in the news recently. This is one of the federal agencies that is under attack right now. And it is because of the LSTA funding that we were able to digitize, translate, understand many of the materials that are in this collection. So we're very grateful to have had that funding, and I will just make you aware of that in case that is of interest to you. The other thing that really, one of the other things that really makes the work of the Oregon Historical Society possible is an incredible ecosystem of scholars and researchers and students and cultural organizations that exists here in Portland and in Oregon and beyond. And the Japanese American Museum of Oregon is an incredibly important partner for OHS, an incredibly important organization for all of us in understanding some of the history we're going to hear about tonight and much more. So who's been to the Japanese American Museum of Oregon? Excellent. Isn't it amazing? Yes. Okay, if you didn't raise your hand, you have to go. And if you did raise your hand, you probably should go back because there's always new exhibitions that are happening there. There's information on the table by the front door about JAMO, and you're going to learn a little bit more about that tonight. So as I introduce our speaker, Hanako Wakatsuki-Chong is Executive Director of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon in Portland and is professionally trained as a public historian, political scientist, and museologist. For 17 years, she has worked for state and federal agencies at the Idaho State Historical Society, the United States Navy, the National Park Service, and the White House Office of the Chief of Staff, holding roles as interpretive specialist, education specialist, chief of interpretation and education, superintendent, and policy advisor throughout her government career. In 2021, she received the Esto Perpetua Award for Lifetime Achievement, doesn't need to do anything else now, from the Idaho State Historical Society for her work in preservation of Japanese American incarceration history in Idaho. She holds a BA in history and a BS in political science from Boise State University, as well as an MA in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University, where she serves as an adjunct faculty member for their Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, Museum Studies, and Cultural Heritage Management programs. Hanako also served as an advisor on this exhibit and is an informal advisor to many of us in the work that we do here at OHS. The presentation you're going to hear tonight is one that she has worked on and revised over many years. We're really thrilled to have this program kicking off our Yasui program series. Please join me in welcoming Hanako.
Let's see. Could you hear me now? Okay, I think it's on. Well, thank you so much, Eliza. I just want to let you know that I have to kind of almost make out with this mic so you all can hear me. So it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable at times. And then if I move away, please let me know so I could send her back. So, group effort, I need help with this. I am here to kind of give you guys a Incarceration 101 history. So I do want to just describe this image that you're looking at right now. So it's a black and white photo that you're seeing a family of four where a father is holding a child, a mother is looking into a garage where her other child is standing in front of her. And on the garage, it says, "No Japs wanted." So this is a photo that's actually from the Seattle area, Beacon Hill, and it's actually of some of my family, extended family members, of what they went back home to after the war. So we'll come back to this image afterwards and throughout the presentation. But I just want to let you know that as we go through my presentation, I'm going to be showing a lot of images and just kind of deconstructing some of the images for better understanding. But as we go through looking at some of these photos, I'm going to show you a quick film that would incorporate it as well, and I'll kind of contextualize it for you as we go forward. But some of these photos that's on this slide is one of my grandfather. So you see a gentleman in a U.S. Army uniform. He fought for the United States military, and we're going to revisit what happened after the war with him. On the right side, you see an image of Farewell to Manzanar. So I know a lot of people's entry into learning about the Japanese American incarceration history kind of started either with Farewell to Manzanar, Hotel on the Corner, Bitter and Sweet, or some of those other novels that have recently come out. But this book is actually of my family history, so if you've read it, you now know more about me than I know about you. And then below that is an image of my grandmother with my Auntie Patty standing next to her, my Uncle George squatting in front of my Aunt Patty and my Uncle Woody in my grandmother's lap in front of a barrack at Manzanar. So this history is very personal to me because my family was impacted by the incarceration, and it still impacts me today. And we'll kind of talk about some of that generational trauma as we go through this. So this short film I'm going to show you is a product of something actually that I created when I was with the National Park Service, or actually my intern created. Back in 2020 for Tadaima, which is a community virtual pilgrimage that we did during COVID. And so we re-upped it for 2022 for the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066 that we did in conjunction with the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, and the White House. So this, I'm going to call it a music video, is going to take you from immigration to incarceration through a visual lens. And then we're going to look at some of the images afterwards, okay? So that was Kishibashi, who, if you guys don't know of Kishibashi, he has a really good album that kind of focuses on the incarceration. And he's a big community supporter of telling the story. Although his family was not incarcerated during World War II, he's of the new immigrant wave, what we call Shinnikkei, and he's very supportive of understanding this as part of his own identity. So there's actually a really good film out there called Omoyari. If you have a chance, you should go watch that. It's on Disney, I think, so plug for that. But in my talk, you'll hear me kind of talk a little bit differently about terminology, so I just want to bring that up with you all. So and within the Japanese American community and the academic community, there has been tons of discussions about this since I want to say 1994 is when we could first start documenting like more of a community discussion. And that was actually spurred by an exhibit that went to Ellis Island when they were using the term American concentration camp. So there was a lot of communication that we had with the Jewish American community as well as the Japanese American community of how we want to talk about things. So you'll hear me use the terms incarceration or concentration camp, and also use the term of incarceree or survivor for those who experienced it. The reason why we're going away from internee or internment is because it's not the actual, the definition doesn't actually pertain to most of the people who are incarcerated. So under the Geneva Convention and other definitions of war, it was a concentration camp where you concentrated large people in there. The government was actually using the terms concentration camps. President Roosevelt was using it as such. The Secretary of Interior was using the term concentration camp as well. Internment is specifically used to describe people who are not U.S. citizens who are decided to be removed from the community. If you're at war with the nation that they're a citizen of, you could intern them into a camp. And that's proper internment, and that would have only been for the first generation Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. But what ended up happening was they took children all the way up to 1/16, so they use a blood quantum to identify people who were deemed so-called threats, and they incarcerated them. So 2/3 of the people who were actually incarcerated were actually U.S. citizens. So internment doesn't adequately describe this whole situation. So this is why I use abridging terms of incarceration, but people were imprisoned by their government. So, and if you want more resources, I could provide that later, or you could go onto our website. We do have resources there that describes this as well. So, but you'll notice that a lot of academics are starting to use this, like starting in I want to say 2000. The National Park Service finally came out, I want to say 2019 or 20, with their own terminology paper to adhere to what academia is going by. So let's kind of go through the overview of the Japanese American history. So I like to always first start off with the end, because if people don't quite understand the Japanese American incarceration experience, I feel like there's been a lot of miseducation on why this happened, right? So even though I want to start at the beginning, let's kind of start at the end. There was this document that was created, and it was a document that was commissioned in 1982. It was a congressional report that said this was due to racism, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. This is what ended up leading to the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, where President Reagan offered an official apology to the Japanese American community that this was wrong. So I just want to start there so you all know how it ended, where the government was like, yep, we made a mistake and we're going to own up to it. So, and through this report, the official recommendation was the official apology and to provide reparations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. So, but let's kind of talk about immigration to the United States. So in the film, we had a little thing that talks about how Commodore Perry forced open Japan, and it kind of messed up the economy, so that's why there was a lot of immigration coming here. But then there was also the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that also helped is not the right word, but encouraged Japanese immigrants to then come in because there was a labor force that was needed. And a lot of the labor force was used for unskilled laborers working in the lumber industry or in farming or other industries there. But as people start to settle down, they start creating communities. Even though racially, sometimes they're like profiled to be like, we don't want you in our community, they start to build their own communities. So that's how Nihon Machi was created down in Old Town. So that area that a lot of people know as Chinatown, before it was Chinatown, was actually Japantown. And it's because of some redlining and discriminatory practices that Japanese Americans ended up congregating down there and created their own community. But when the incarceration happened, that's where people were forcibly removed, and it turned more into Chinatown because of the vacancy. But as people were settling down, they're creating community, whether being part of churches. So the image on the left is a picture of a congregation of the Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, having a photo, and you can see there's people of many different generations in that image. But then they're also starting to build a home life. So on the image on the right, you see a handsome family, father looking down at, I assume, a daughter, sitting on a couch with his wife. They're creating the sense of home, right? They're starting to create their own community. So I love the image on the left because it's actually from the 20s, and it's a Valentine's dance. So you can kind of see everyone in like their flapper kind of hairdo and everything like that. And people are like enjoying themselves, going out to the parks, doing picnics, but they're trying to create this community of the sense of belonging so they could feel safe because of all the other discriminatory practices that they're facing. And some people, as they're establishing themselves, they're starting to thrive a bit, right? So we have an image of the Cascade Soda Water Company that was actually owned by a Japanese American. And he ended up selling it, actually a little bit before the war. But then you also have, other folks are starting to flourish in their own homes. They're buying nicer things. You see there's a piano behind the girls over on the right-hand side. And what happens when you start seeing other communities thrive? Sometimes animosity sets in. People start, wondering why are they doing better than us or whatnot. And that was hard for people because not everyone was living like that. So we got a nice picture of the WWII family. They're in Hood River. This is them farming. Some people went into agricultural business, doing stuff like that out there. We also have Mr. Yasuda. So this was kind of in that music video, right? But he's the gentleman that's looking at us, right? And so he was actually kind of a frontiers person, going out in Alaska and actually settled the town of Beaver, Alaska, So it's a really, people within our community were participating in kind of developing some of the Pacific Northwest or creating community or creating businesses, all contributing to the economy and what we see as the United States. So, but then there's all this racial prejudice where you see, people using the derogatory terms of JAPs. So the image on the right is from Rose Hill, where it says, JAPs, don't let the sun set on you here, keep moving, this is Rose Hill. And the image on the right is really interesting because it's a bunch of white women on a 4th of July parade. So this is a parade from 1935, I believe, in San Francisco, where on the side of their parade float says, patronize white laundries only. They're an anti-JAP laundry league. So, and you see people are smiling, right? So this is the one thing I'll come back at the end where it's like, they thought that was the right thing to do. And as a younger person, I guess I'm no longer as young as I think I am, but when I see that, it's kind of cringy. It's like, oh my gosh, like that would be horrible if it was my family member or ancestor, But that's why it makes me think about the choices I make today, because I don't want to ever be used as an example in the future. But anyways, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, that's what kind of drums up a lot of the anti-Asian and specifically anti-Japanese American hysteria during this time. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Alien Enemies Act. I know that that's been a conversation a little bit. So, and I'm going to use it in a case study of my own family. So this is my family. So the big image on the back is of my Auntie Jeannie. She was about 7 years old at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the back row is on the left is my grandmother. To the right is my grandfather in a really small suit. I think he was borrowing it, but he's a little bit busting out of it. And then in that middle row, it goes my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, then my great-grandfather, and on my great-grandfather's lap is my uncle Georgie, and then my auntie Patty in the yellow dress. So I had 4 generations of my family incarcerated during World War II. So my father was actually the first child born free after the camp in 1948, but his immediately older sister was born in camp in 1945 at Manzanar. So my great-grandfather on the far right, because of the Alien Enemies Act was invoked, he was actually taken away from our family. And our family didn't know where he was for many, many months. And he was taken away, I believe, February of 1942 and wasn't reintroduced into our family until September. So there were, several months where no one knew what was going on, right? And so my great-grandmother was frantic trying to figure out what's going on. And so their children, they had 10 children. There's no birth control at the time, right? And so my grandfather was one of the middle kids. So he was like the oldest of the youngest. So he still had 5 siblings under the age of 18. And so my great-grandmother was busy trying to figure out what is going on, where is my husband, and my grandfather ended up stepping in as the head of household to try to organize the family because his older siblings had their own families to deal with. And so my grandmother, who would have been the daughter-in-law, she was essentially the surrogate mother to 5 of my great aunts and uncles during this time. So you have to think about how the Alien Enemies Act impacted just one family. This is just my family. But there's all these other nuances within other families of especially not knowing where people are going and not even knowing if you could find them, like they disappeared. And my grandfather was disappeared and he was interrogated by the FBI and actually came back a little bit broken. And when he was reintroduced, it was back in camp. So I know I'm kind of jumping over in the timeline, but he came back abusive and an alcoholic. So you have to kind of think about the realities of sometimes what the imprisonment could do to people if it breaks people. Anyway, so let's kind of talk about the sites of incarceration. A lot of people don't realize that there's this many sites. Most people know about the 10 camps, which are indicated by these triangles, where you have 2 in California, 2 in Arizona, 1 in Utah, 1 in Idaho, 1 in Wyoming, 1 in Colorado, and then 2 in Arkansas. But there's all these other sub-camps here. So, and some of them are detention facilities, some of them are temporary detention facilities before people went into the War Relocation Authority sites, which is the more permanent camps of those 10 main camps that people know about. And then some of them are isolation centers or they're Department of Army sites. And so there's a whole variety of sites that people went to. But a lot of people may not know, but the Portland Expo Center was one of those sites. So before people were sent to the War Relocation Authority sites, they were sent to these other facilities, these temporary detention facilities, until the main sites were developed. And so here at the Expo Center, we had people from the Hood River area was incarcerated there, people from Western Oregon was incarcerated there, and then also people from Central Washington. And eventually, the folks from Central Washington ended up going to Heart Mountain in Wyoming up here. The folks from the Hood River area ended up going to Tule Lake down here, so that's where most of Minyasui's family went to. And then the folks in the Western Oregon area went to Minidoka and Idaho. So, but what led to folks being forcibly removed? So we're going to talk a little bit about Executive Order 9066. So this executive order was written by, established or whatever, issued by President Roosevelt. But essentially it says that the government could create military areas and restrict people from it. So a lot of people sometimes say like, well, it was used to get Japanese Americans out. But the mechanism of it was used to specifically target certain people of certain populations, but in the executive order, it was actually broad. It didn't say only Japanese Americans are going to get targeted, or only German Americans or Italian Americans. It just says the military could create these exclusion zones and exclude people from it. So, and here, let's go back. So on this map, the exclusion zone, is indicated by this red line. And so originally there was one exclusion zone, which actually went from here and then went all the way down the middle of California. And then, I don't even think it went to Arizona. I'm actually not sure. But then eventually they ended up expanding it to military zone number 2 that incorporated the rest of California and then Arizona. So some people, during a small window of time, they're like, hey, if I move to Fresno, I'll be beyond the exclusion zone. And then, like, eventually the exclusion zone went over Fresno, and they're like, oh, okay. So that happened. So, but with the forced removal, many people only got a few days or maybe a week at most saying, hey, you're going to have to remove yourself from this location and report to another location. And all you could do is, bring what you can carry. And so that was very stressful. So the military was posting these notices all around, saying, hey, we have this civilian exclusion order, you're going to have to leave. And so again, most of the folks went to these temporary detention facilities. So there was Puyallup in Washington, and then the Expo Center here, which, just to let you know, here in Portland, halls A, B, and C are the historic structures of where the people were incarcerated. So there was about over 3,000 people was incarcerated there. And then you have a lot of these assembly centers down here, like Tulare, Santa Anita, and whatnot. So most folks went there. There were some people who went directly into the camps, but it was very few. So the folks in Bainbridge Island ended up going to Manzanar at first. And then, so they were up here, they were sent to Manzanar, and then eventually to Minidoka. But yeah. So the reason why they started off with Bainbridge Island is because a lot of people, academics, believe that they needed a case study. Like, how are we going to move, 120,000 people off the West Coast? Or actually, it was 110,000 people or so, like 115. And so at Bainbridge Island, there was like 27 people that they were removing. So they actually brought in the National Guard from New Jersey to help facilitate this move. And it was really interesting because a lot of the men and the National Guard weren't sure. They're like, what's going on? Because on the East Coast, they're facing other potential threats, about Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, but they're not experiencing the same anti-Japanese sentiment on the West Coast. So one of my friends, his name was Frank, he passed away. I think he's right there. He was, I think, 3 or 4 as a child going to camp, and he says that he had this distinct memory because eventually he was too tired to walk down this dock, so someone carried him, and it was a National Guard guy, and he remembers seeing him cry, and he remembered talking to his mom like, why is he crying? But then as an adult reflecting, he's like, I bet the guy just didn't know what was going on. So yeah. And then you have other folks this is images from California of folks. This is another actually Bainbridge Island of a woman, I assume she's lamenting her life, she's being forcibly removed and doesn't know where she's going. But this is the other part that was super demeaning, is that our families were just given a family number, and we were referred to a family number, and we were given these tags that also went on our luggage, but then also on our person. And so that's where it's hard, where you start seeing the breakdown of just being treated as a human, right? And a lot of people still remember that, So, and then this is an interesting image. This is of actually a World War I veteran who reported to his assembly center in his uniform to be like, dude, I'm an American, So you could tell that he was in the Navy. I believe that, I'm not going to interpret this because I totally forgot what it is. It's yeoman, I think is what he was. But anyways, this is kind of the weird thing where it's we had military veterans who are showing up who's okay, you're now saying that we're suspicious just because of our ethnicity? So again, when people were being removed, they're going from these temporary assembly centers into these 10 camps. And the reason why they had to go through these temporary detention facilities is because when the government at first created plans to do a mass incarceration, it was a true internment. It was for the first generation immigrants who were Japanese citizens that because the government knew that we were going to enter into war. So once they enter into war, they're like, we think it's going to be between 20 and 30,000 people that we will intern. And they identified Poston and Manzanar as sites. The person who was in charge of the Western Defense Command, which ends up going kind of all the way up in this area, his name was General John DeWitt. He was based out of San Francisco. And he was like, we're going to take anyone and everyone of Japanese ancestry, right? And he went full-on racist, like where he's like, we're going to take children out of orphanages. So actually, Manzanar is the only camp that actually had an orphanage where they took children and put them in there. So anyways, so when the government found out, they're like, ooh, yikes, this is way more people than we thought. So the government actually had to negotiate with governors and other like city officials across the nation to actually identify these other sites. So that's why you'll see where people were in these temporary detention facilities for about 4 months before they were sent to the main camps. But yeah, but once they were sent to the main camps, this is their imprisonment. You know, a lot of people like to believe in this notion where they're like, oh, they had to be protected. You know, we're protecting them from other people. It's like, no, the guns were pointing inside, right? You had all of these kind of signage, you know, and then they had to actually get stopped, you know, at the front entrance before coming in. And it actually made it a little bit difficult for some of the men, the Nisei soldiers who were coming back, because they also, like, once they crossed this imaginary line, they were no longer an equal in the service. They were seen as, you know, one of the inmates. But people were trying to, you know, build out their lives and, you know, try to rebuild their lives in a sense, even though they had no control. You know, you got fence lines that went all the way around. You got sentry posts there. All the buildings, the barracks, were actually hastily built. So we have records that some of these buildings, they only recommended 59 minutes to construct. And each one of these buildings actually housed between 5 and 6 families at a time. So quality wasn't that great. You know, they're basically scrubbing the fields, especially in Idaho, where this is of Minidoka, where this was just, it was just sagebrush. And so the Bureau of Reclamation was like, hey, y'all could use our land if you guys have Japanese Americans, you know, basically build out the infrastructure for this to be farmlands, and then you could use it, but you need to give the land back to us afterwards, which they did. And so this area of Idaho is known as the Magic Valley, and it's because it's so magical. You took the desert and made it into farmlands. So Japanese Americans are actually part of that legacy of the farming and agricultural purposes out there. But yeah, so this is what people were looking at. You know, they were coming in from having private lives, but living a communal life. You know, they were eating together. They were sleeping together without partitions. They were showering together without partitions. You know, this is a map of Minidoka where from one end over here to one end over here was about a 2 mile, I think 2.5 mile walk. And so you had most of the people from the Washington area, Seattle area up here, and then the Portlanders and Oregonians down here. But I mentioned the Bainbridge Islanders was eventually transferred to Minidoka. They were brought into Block 44 down here. So remember how I pointed out my friend Frank? He always told me that he hated it when mom was like, we're gonna go see grandma. Because, you know, he had to walk from here to there. And as a kid, it seemed like it took all day. And especially when during wintertime, he's like, oh my God, I had to get bundled up and I'd get stuck in the mud because the dirt was just saturated with moisture, that he was just like this little starfish that couldn't really do much. So yeah, but, you know, you see what daily life, you know, people are standing up to line up to get their food. You know, this wasn't normal for them. You know, before they were sitting within their family units, having dinner, enjoying time together. But if you had, you know, grandma, grandpa who are unable to go get food, mom and dad will have to go get food for them. The kids are left by themselves. And this actually contributed majorly to the breakdown of the family structure. But this is a really unique photo that I like to show, because this is one of the few photos that are in color that we found at Minidoka specifically, but of also the Issei generation. And the reason why we know it's for the older folks is because only children and older folks got served milk. So a lot of these folks, and you could kind of tell with the white hair, that these are the Issei. So this is a very precious photo that we were able to find on Minidoka. And then I know that this photo, I think, was shown in the film as well. This is an interesting picture because a lot of people, I always wonder what people think of it. So you have 3 children eating hot dogs, right? And when I used to do tours for kids, they're like, oh, they're trying to be Americans. That's why they're eating hot dogs. But the sad story of this is that this is actually Christmas, 1944. This is the meal that American citizens got for their Christmas dinner, when there was literally a prisoner of war camp about 40 miles away, and that actually held German soldiers who were caught on the front line, brought to the United States for labor. They were served a proper Christmas meal. And that's because under the Geneva Convention, the United States, when you're dealing with prisoners of war, you treat the other prisoners how you would treat your own prisoners, or how you would treat your own soldiers. So then they get equitable treatment. But yet you can now see the difference of treating a prisoner of war versus your own citizens. But this is one of my favorite photos where I see this as an act of defiance. For some of you who may not see, you have 2 people holding like a plank of wood, but in the background it says U.S. property. Theft or damage punishable under federal law. And here they're stealing this to probably make furniture out of it. So there are aspects of people trying to find ways to make things in their life, but there was a lot of idleness, a lot of people just not knowing what to do, especially the older folks, because you had the breakdown of the family structure, and then you also had within the community, the older folks who, like the parents' generation, they weren't allowed to hold any prestige within the camps. They couldn't hold any anything other than they could maybe volunteer for a fire, to be a firefighter or whatever, but more likely they're older, but they couldn't hold any power positions. It only went to American-born children. So it also disrupted the family dynamic. And then you get a lot of people just being idle. And so depression sets in, right? We also have incidents of people committing suicide. So, but some people are trying to find different ways to add beauty to their life. So you have some folks who are building out a garden for themselves. But this is one of the most intricate gardens that was at Minidoka. This is the Kogita garden. And you could see that there's one of the white administrator was taking a portrait here. And then this is Mr. Kogita who helped build this. And he had, I think, 3 sons. I only knew 2 of them. But I think his son was saying how his father would use the kids as mules, and they actually dragged this 1-ton chimney rock out of the fields because Minidoka is actually part of the Yellowstone hotspot, so there's a lot of basalt out there. And so at the end of the war, the administration was like, okay, we could send your belongings wherever you want to go. And so he's like, Mr. Kogita's like, I want my garden. And so the administrator, Harry L. Stafford, was like, yeah, we'll send it to you. And so this is now, most of these features is now at his son's house in Seattle, minus this rock because someone stole it. We tried to replace it, but with national parks, you can't take stuff off the land, so we were finding stuff on adjacent property, but it's a little bit of a different color. But it still kind of exists. But how great is that, where it's all like, dude, you screwed us over. I want my rocks. And then the government was like, yeah, sure, you can have your rocks. But, folks were kind of living in situations where, it was really, really cold during the winter times where most people are from the Seattle, Portland area. They're not used to this, right? So it's really hard for folks. But then you have this image of a woman bending over, and it's interesting because the National Archives originally had this identified as woman gathering dirt. But the sad part of this is that she's actually trying to get coal. But this is the remnants of the coal that she's able to get to heat up her barrack. So especially if you're at the time, if you're not able to go get stuff immediately, sometimes you didn't have access to all the good stuff, right? So that's where community had to work with each other to make sure everyone got what they needed to survive. But, life continued on. People were getting married, people were having children. But then there was also deaths in camps. So there was actually a cemetery in the camp at Minidoka and actually at all the other sites. But then you also see this is an individual celebrating his 88th birthday. So that's a big date for people in the Japanese culture because the kanji is like it looks like rice. So it's like, anyways, it's a big deal. So, but then you also have kids being kids, right? So you have like kids on the uneven bars, girlfriends hanging out, taking photos, someone, trying to be a muscle man, whatever, and then, people going into the swimming hole, like diving and whatnot. So even though all this stuff is happening, people were just trying to still create a life for themselves, right? And then there was also a cinema, and this is, again, one of the few color photos that we have of this. And actually, this image is in color, but I don't know why I grabbed the black and white version. So that's another color image that we have. So, and then, people are just being kids, there were schools. This is also like I find it a little sad photo because this is a high school group, and the students were learning how to farm because the government was like, more likely, this is the type of job that they're going to get. Like, they may not go to college because of their situation, and they're, so let's give them a life lesson so they could carry on, which I'm all like, that would be really sad if someone was telling me, this is all what we expect you to be. So yeah, but then they were also providing, other technical skills, for folks to be carpenters, to be welders and whatnot, but as people left camps, sometimes they were ostracized for taking good jobs from other people. So, but then we also have, graduations happening. And then we also had people who went to the military. I kind of talked a little bit about this, but some folks were drafted or enlisted into the military. This is a gentleman, Ben Kuroki. He was actually from Nebraska. And so his family was never incarcerated. And he was in the Army before Pearl Harbor happened. So he was already participating in other activities and drills. So when he was deployed into Europe, he actually, I think, completed 20 missions? And then they're like, hey, you could go stateside now. So what the government did was like, hey, here's a Japanese American. Let's have him recruit Japanese Americans. And a lot of people, it depends which camp they went to, but at Heart Mountain, people got upset in Wyoming because they're like, dude, your family's not in camp. Why are you trying to tell us that we need to fight for this notion of freedom? But then when he came to Minidoka, he was really well received. So it shows the dynamics of the Japanese American community, that it's not one homogenous community. People had different ideas and different takes on stuff. So, but then we also have women going into the military as well. But then you also have people paying the ultimate price. Like, this is one of my friends, her mom and dad, mourning over the loss of their son. But then you have the 442, which is the most decorated unit in the U.S. Army. A lot of people like to qualify it's for its size and length of service, but when I talk to Army historians, they're like, it's going to be a generation or two until they're bumped. So to me, if you qualify it, I don't think that does justice, because when you qualify it, it makes it sound like, oh, the only reason why they're known for it's because of their size and length of service, but that actually is not a thing. So so that's why I don't use that qualifying factor, because I think it kind of takes away from what they did on the field. So, but yeah, folks ended up passing away. But then eventually the government acknowledged the soldiers with the Congressional Gold Medal for their service, including the Military Intelligence Service. But there are also folks who were, didn't want to join because they're like, give me back my citizenship and I'll fight for this nation. But you're not treating us as U.S. citizens, so no thank you. So you had folks who didn't want to go get enlisted or wanted to go to where they need to go to get inducted into the military. That's the word, induction. But this is an image of a mass trial that was done in Heart Mountain, where I believe it was like 50 people or so. All these young men chose to obey the draft saying, give us back our freedom and we'll join. So there's a gentleman right up here. He's still alive. His name is Takashi Hoshizaki. And it's interesting. He was 17 years old at the time. And And he was, petitioning this, basically saying like, hey, this is a civil liberties issue. So he was actually sentenced to, I want to say it's like 15 or 16 months in federal penitentiary. And he said that he felt bad every single day that he was there because he had access to his own private cell, his own bathroom, a radio, a library, and he was way more comfortable than when he was at Heart Mountain being incarcerated. So he said every single day he felt bad that his parents had to endure the camps. But interesting story is he is actually a veteran. So when the Korean War came around, he got drafted, and he's like, my civil liberties are intact, and I shall serve. So here you have an example of a draft resistor who is also a veteran because he was trying to fight for what was right. But then you also had some folks who are put in a really difficult situation to give up their citizenship, where they're like, hey, the government sometimes pressured people saying, hey, why don't you just go back to Japan, start your family, do that, maybe that's better. Sometimes the families were like, mom and dad's like, hey, it doesn't seem like the government wants us here, let's head back. So they asked the children to all go back together. There were also some younger folks who were just like, F this, if my government doesn't want me here, maybe I'll just try to find a way in Japan. And many never been to Japan or spoke the language. And so there's a variety of reasons of why people repatriated, but it was later known that it was under extreme duress when they were being asked to do so. But we also have folks who were challenging the Supreme Court for civil liberties and civil rights. So you got Minya Sui on the left, Gordon Hidebayashi. They both were fighting and contesting the curfew, saying, hey, this is not appropriate. And then you also have Frank Korematsu over here that was kind of challenging more of the incarceration. But since we have the Yasui family exhibit here, Minya Sui's story was he was challenging the curfew, and essentially he was walking around Old Town trying to get picked up because he's like, hey, I'm Japanese American, it's after the curfew, I'm breaking the law, and people are like, just go home. But he was adamant because he wanted to challenge the courts because he was the first Japanese American that was admitted into the Oregon State Bar, and he's like, this is wrong. So essentially, he was incarcerated in the Multnomah County Jail for about 9 months in solitary confinement, and then eventually the Supreme Court said, no, it was due to national security, this is why you have to go, sorry. Oh, you served your time, now we're going to send you to Minidoka. So he went from solitary confinement in Multnomah County to Minidoka to serve out the, I guess with everyone else. And so it was kind of his lifelong career to, deal with some of the civil liberties and civil rights issues. And it was really interesting because we actually had George Takei here a few weeks ago. And I was showing him Minya Sui's jail because we have that in our museum. And he was like, you know what? I know Min. We were like roommates in college. And because I think that they did a thing, was it at Sophia University or one of the universities in Japan? And they got to know each other. So it's one of those like small world things. But essentially we have Mitsuya Endo who challenged the Supreme Court. And it was her that actually ended the incarceration because she's like, yo, we didn't get our due process and we're Americans. So could you, either charge us with a crime or let us go? And so the government knew that they were kind of caught in that aspect where they're like, yeah, we actually do have a constitutional issue. So they let the administration know saying, hey, we're going to rule against the US, the government in this case. So a few days before the judgment came out, President Roosevelt was like, we're going to close the camps next year, essentially trying to nullify this. But earlier this year, Mitsuya Endo ended up getting posthumously awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal. And so that's the second highest award. But I do have to say, the men here, all got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and they lost their cases, which I like to say, it tracks. Women is always getting the short end of everything. So, she only gets the second highest award, and it was well after the 3 men got their Presidential Medal of Freedom. But yeah, essentially with the closing of the camps, people were given $25 and a one-way ticket to rebuild their lives. They're like, good luck. And so this image up here is of a ticket that's in the Minidoka National Historic Sites collection of someone's ticket to Chicago to rebuild their lives. But then this is what people were getting when they went back. You have stuff that says JAPs, you keep out, you rats, and it didn't make for a welcoming homecoming. So the realities of starting over, I like to use my family. So I mentioned that my grandfather was in the US Army. He ended up going into the military intelligence service and was doing post-occupation Japan and doing some other stuff. When he came back from the war front, no one really wanted to work with him. He couldn't get a job, so he ended up becoming a door-to-door salesman, where he's like, if someone's not going to hire me, maybe I'll just be my own boss. But then what happened was people didn't want to buy from a Japanese American. So he had to go do something else. So he ended up becoming a Nisei wrestler. So there was a whole generation of Japanese American men becoming wrestlers during this time, and it's because white wrestlers need an enemy to fight. So my grandfather ended up doing very stereotypical Japanese things, throwing out like salt and stuff like that, kind of sumo-esque. But he ended up doing, these circuits, which it's like, at times I wonder where it's like, he valiantly served his country, yet he couldn't find a job, and he had to debase himself to put food on the table for his family, because again, no birth control, you're not like, there's not a lot of planned family stuff. He ended up having 8 children, so he had to take care of a family of 10. And so even my aunties and uncles are like, yeah, Dad was never around because he was on this wrestling circuit to provide food for his family. But fast forward to the redress movement, we finally get that report done, and then you also have the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that was enacted and signed by President Reagan. So one person I'd like to kind of focus on is this person. This is Norm Mineta. He was a representative of California at the time. But, this history keeps on repeating itself, right? Because then, I guess I started too soon. So we got the official government apology. And I'll go back to the Norm story, sorry. I keep on flipping my slides around, so I kind of messed up, so I apologize in advance. But with the official government apology, they started off with the older survivors. So my grandfather died in the 70s, so he never got an apology because this was in the 80s, right? And they only started with living survivors, oldest first, down to the youngest. So my grandmother ended up getting hers first. So she got a letter from George H.W. Bush. And, but then her youngest daughter was my Aunt Joannie. She ended up getting a letter from President Clinton because she was a younger survivor. But I remember as a child, my grandmother lost her vision later in life, but as she walked up the steps to her room, there were these 2 letters. And as a kid, I'm always like, why do you have letters from the president? Like, this is super weird, right? But I didn't understand it now until I became an adult, where I was like, you know what? Like, when my grandmother walked up, she always touched the frames because it was one on top of the other as she turned around the corner to get to her room. And I realized this is a thing that helped her feel seen. That official apology helped her feel seen because I remember as a child, my dad was like, oh, you should ask Grandma about camp. Not realizing I'm like this 16-year-old that has like this camcorder. It's like, Grandma, tell me about the worst time of your life, right? I had no clue that I was doing that. And I remember when she would tell me, and I'm using air quotes, what camp was like, she'll be like, yeah, as a kid, I played tennis in the streets. Me and my girlfriends would go do this. And I was like, oh, I thought you were in your 20s, right? And finally, she just said, Hanako, I don't want to talk about this. And she was highly religious. So she said, God would give me a task, wouldn't give me a task that I couldn't endure. And that was it. That is all she said about it. And at the time, I didn't quite understand, but I was like, okay, Grandma's mad. I'll just turn this off, whatever. But as I've been studying this history for the last almost 20 years and talking to other, I would call them surrogate family members, telling me their story, I now understand how, and I'm going to use a bad word, how shitty it was for me as a kid to be like, Grandma, tell me about this, right? And it makes me appreciate more about the stories that you hear as well, where I know that there was someone actually here in Oregon every single day would go to the mailbox waiting for the apology. And at the time, the kids thought she was waiting for the checks because there was a reparation check of $20,000. And they're like, Mom, we'll give you the money. You could just give us your check later. But that's not what she wanted. She was waiting for this letter to validate her experience so she could feel seen. And she ended up passing away 2 days before her letter arrived. So you hear a lot of stories about that. And I know I'm starting to run out of time. But yeah, there was like failure of leadership because one of the things I didn't really cover was there were these intelligence reports, the Ringo report and the Munson report, that was suppressed during the Korematsu, the Hirabayashi, and the Yasui cases that led to the Supreme Court saying, hey, this is because of national security. And these two reports said, like the Ringo report was like, hey, we've been monitoring the community since the 30s. There's no need to take anyone because we already have a list of people that we would like to take, and that's where the people with the Alien Enemies Act, they were taken. And then the Munson report was like, yeah, we've been monitoring the community and there's no need for mass incarceration. And so that was all kind of swept under the rug. So, but anyways, okay, now going back to Norman Netta. So we have Norman Netta over here. And, he was present for the signing of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. But this is where, things are very similar. You see history repeats itself over and over and over again. So we have September 11th, and a lot of people say, hey, this is like our Pearl Harbor, right? The one thing that was interesting is that Norman Netta is Secretary of Transportation Norman Netta. Before he became the Secretary of Transportation, he had a long conversation with George W. Bush. President Bush wanted to understand, hey, tell me about your childhood, what happened? So Norm was about, I think, 10 when he went into camp at Heart Mountain. So he was incarcerated as a child and ended up becoming a statesman and then now servicing his country under the Clinton administration as the Secretary of Commerce and then also serving under the Bush administration, being one of the few people going between Democratic and Republican administrations as the Secretary of Transportation. So the one thing that happened was after the attacks on September 11th, the president was swept to the PIOC, which is the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, which is below the White House, and all the cabinet secretaries had to come. And so everyone at that time was saying, we should do another incarceration. They're using the term internment. We should do an internment. We should do like what we did with the Japanese during World War II. And the one thing that President Bush said was, no, we're not going to do what we did to Norm. And this is why representation in government is really important. Because if Norm wasn't there, who knows what would have happened? Because some other stuff happened, right? The one thing that we learned was, maybe not have these incarceration sites on U.S. soil. We had Guantanamo Bay, which is kind of similar. But you also see the Islamophobia, right? What does this remind you of? It reminds me of this, right? But we have other stuff, too. We have the Students for Solidarity protest. So I know I'm running over, but I have an 8-minute video that I want to share with you all, because this is coming from the individuals, the survivors' point of view. So it's going to be 8 minutes long. I think it's actually maybe 6.
My name is Satsuki Ina. I'm a former child incarceree during World War II. This is a photograph of me when I was imprisoned. 75 years ago, 120,000 of us were removed from our homes and forcefully incarcerated in prison camps across the country. We're here today to protest the repetition of history. We were in American concentration camps. We were held under indefinite detention. We were without due process of law. We were charged without any evidence of being a threat to national security, that we were an unassimilable race, that we would be a threat to the economy. We hear these exact words today regarding innocent people seeking asylum in this country. And unlike 1942, when America turned their back on us while we were disappearing from our homes, our schools, our farms, and our jobs. We're here today to speak out, to protest the unjust incarceration of innocent people seeking refuge in this country. We stand with them, and we are saying, stop repeating history.
My name is Kiyoshi Ina. I'm from Concord, California, and I spent the first 4.5 years in a concentration camp. I was born in Topaz, Utah, and I'm here to protest against the incarceration of the immigrant children here at Fort Sill.
I'm Nikki Nojima Lewis, and on December 7th, 1941, in Seattle, Washington, I was celebrating my 4th birthday when the FBI interrupted my birthday party and removed my father to Lordsburg, New Mexico, the DOJ camp, and subsequently Santa Fe, New Mexico. My mother and I were incarcerated at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, called Camp Harmony, and later in Minidoka, Idaho.
You cannot protest on Fort Sill. If you want to protest, you have to go across the street, the highway, and that needs to happen right now. Let's go, let's go, let's go, now, today.
My name is Chizu Omori.
Saying a couple more statements,
No,
please.
no, ma'am, you may not. You may, again, I will say it, this is the last time. You cannot protest on Fort Sill. You need to move across the street now.
Chizu, were you going to make a statement?
Go ahead, Chizu.
Yes.
Apparently you didn't hear what I said.
I'm sorry, sir.
You need to move today, now, right now. Move.
Otherwise, what will happen?
I don't know. No, I'm not going to arrest you, but you need to move now.
Then we're not going to move.
Yes, you're going to move.
If you're not going to arrest us, we're not going to move.
Go ahead.
Okay, yes. Yes, I spent 3.5 years at Poston, Arizona, an American concentration camp during World War II, and I'm here to bear witness to the travesty of the American justice system, in that the family separation policy, which is ruining the lives of these children. I'm very incensed about the government policy of separating parents, and we the people have to stand up and protest this.
My name's Tom Ikeda. I'm the executive director of Densho. It's a nonprofit in Seattle. And one of the things that Densho does is we're the story keepers for the community, especially what happened during World War II. And so I came here to honor the story of Kanasaburo Oshima, who was shot and killed here. 9 years ago, I interviewed his son in Kona, Hawaii, and he told me how this man with 11 children and businesses in Kona was taken for no crime and brought here. And the trauma of being here, the stress, he ended up essentially, as his son said, snapped. And he started climbing the fence in broad daylight saying, "I want to go home." And as the other internees said, "Don't shoot," a guard came up and shot him in the back of his head and killed him. And so in his honor, I'm here to remember Kanasaburo Oshima.
My name is Paul Tomita. I'm from Seattle, Washington. This is me in 1943. As a 4-year-old.
It's English. Get out.
And so what we did with here is I had to have this to get out of Minidoka.
Look. I understand your issues, okay? But you cannot protest on Fort Sill.
All of our elders who are incarceration survivors have stated publicly that they are willing to be arrested in defense of the children who are going to be brought here.
Satsuki, can you please describe what's happening now?
They're wanting us to. They're wanting to remove us. We've been removed too many times. If that's what it comes to,
People understand.
we will stay here and.
What don't you people understand?
We understand the whole history of this country, and we aren't going to let it happen again. What were you saying, Satsuki?
That we want to make a stand. We want to say that we are protesting the fact that 1,400 children are going to be brought to this military site, We're here because we do not want to have that happen. And as former children of prison camps, of concentration camps in America, we are saying no more, never again.
So that happened several years ago, but not too long ago, right? So these are the things, like our country have been doing this over and over again, you know, to other communities, and it's not going to end with our community. But, you know, I always think about, like, what side of history do you want to be a part of, right? You know, we're looking at the float, the 4th of July float. There's this woman pointing, saying, JAPs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. You have stuff like this with, like, you know, the civil rights movement. You got things like this during that time. You know, you have this woman who's harassing Ms. Eckert, you know, who was one of the Little Rock Nines. This is America, who we've been. You know, stuff like this. You know, we have to think about what we're going to stand up for, because, and this is an artist that Erin Shigaki from Seattle has done, which I always like to end on. What kind of ancestor, you know, do we want to be? And we need to think about that as we move forward to create a better future for the next generation, as we entrust them with our future as well, right? So anyways, thank you for your time. I know I went long, but I'll be here for questions.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much, Hanako. We have time for a couple of questions while the group is here, and then Hanako's willing to stick around. We'll keep the exhibit open for a little bit longer this evening. So is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Everybody wants to be like third, but nobody wants to be like first or second.
Or maybe they just want to go home because they trapped them.
That's
for
fine,
almost
too.
like an hour
Going
15.
once? Oh, all right.
And you're going to have to talk really close to the mic.
Sure.
Okay.
My name is Steve Kenny. You've mentioned a couple of times, at least, the breakdown of the family structure. What I was noticing in your slides was that the people were doing a lot of creative things to keep the family structure together. Could you give us some examples of how of the breakdown in family structure of what you're talking about, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like, and just to let you know, like a lot of these images are from the National Archives, which it is coming from a skewed perspective, where it's government photographers going in to take photos. So you have to think about that bias in that lens. And the art wasn't actually, the creative stuff wasn't actually helping to put the family structure back together, because it was just broken irreparably. So a lot of it was, you know, it started little by little, first with like the Alien Enemies Act, where the head of households were taken away, right? So you don't have dad who was the head of household in most of the Japanese American families, and especially in Asian culture, usually, you know, the males are, you know, kind of directing the family, right? So when you remove that person, then, you know, you have to fill in the gap. So that's why, like, my grandfather stepped in. But my grandfather was still young. He was like 25. You know, he was dealing with his growing family, but trying to figure out what to do with his younger siblings and stuff. So then when they were then transposed to then being forced into the temporary detention facility, our family was living in a horse stall. So that dynamic was like, even though they're together, proximity-wise, you know, emotionally, they weren't there to support each other, because everyone is trying to deal with this trauma of this new life. Oh, we're being monitored all the time. You know, there's no partitions in the bathroom. They don't even have indoor plumbing, where, you know, most families, they're coming from homes with indoor plumbing, you know, especially on the coastal area. Some of the rural areas, yeah, they may be more comfortable with, you know, the more rural ways, like of outhouses and whatnot. But that was a shock to many people, right? And then especially like the eating of the meals, you know, that wasn't a communal situation where you just couldn't take a table for your family. You're with other people. But then one aspect that I've heard from some folks who would tell me why their parents did the things that they did was, you know, like someone like Frank, he told me where he said that he thinks that his parents are just trying to let him be a kid. Because as a child, his experience of camp was, I had fun. But it's because they weren't putting the pressure on these like loyalty questionnaires or all these other things for the children to think about. The parents were internalizing and trying to figure out, what are we gonna do? Is this where we should be? Our country is rejecting us. What do we do? Because there was just a lot of nuance within. So like people were just trying to find ways to survive with creative outlets, but it wasn't building back the family unit because that was lost. So that's why it's like, you know, even after camp, like I could see it within my family. Everyone just kind of did their own thing. Like they tried to get back together. Like I have some cousins that's always like, let's try to do a family reunion, you know, but that's only within one branch of our family. Everyone else, like everyone's scattered because with the, with resettlement, like with the closure of the camps, the government was trying to break up the Japanese American communities so they wouldn't return to the West Coast. So they're like, hey, go to Chicago, go to Philadelphia, go to Iowa, to Denver. And so that's why it's like most families are spread out, you know? And so I don't believe that the community was able to regain that structure. And it's through a lot of like, I don't know, therapy, I feel like, that a lot of us, like, you know, I'm 4th, 5th generation Japanese American, you know, we're trying to like stop a lot of the trauma that was passed down to us so we don't accidentally pass it down to others. And because we realize the residual aspects of all these things is impacting us, even though we weren't even around during that time. So, but I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Have any studies been done of children that were in these camps, whether they came out ahead because of the experience or whether they were depressed? Or...
Yeah. So, so Satsuki Ina, who was in that last video where they're like, hey, Satsuki, tell us, you know, recap what happened. So she's actually a psychotherapist. So, you know, she was incarcerated as a kid and realized, wow, our community has trauma. And so she she actually created this documentary called Children of the Camps. And I think it was done in the early 90s. But it kind of showcased the diaspora of experience where there's one individual, his name is Toru. He's still around, I think. But he was angry because he felt like the government failed him because after the camp, I think his mom was a single mother. And I can't remember if like his dad died before camp or during camp. But after the war, I think his mom ended up taking her life because it was so hard to rebuild. So he was bitter and he was like, this is messed up, F the government. But then you had other people who are like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, I had fun, it's fine, or I don't feel racism, you know? And it's a mix of like white adjacency, model minority, accepting aspects to people who are really angry, and it's talking through this. And I wanna say it's like 5 individuals. So you're kind of looking through their lens and seeing where they come from and where they come out of it together. So I recommend like looking at that, but there has been tons of studies on not necessarily the children of the camps, but there was these sociological studies that was done immediately after the war. So you could get the raw data online. Because I remember I was going through it where the sociologist was like asking people before they left, like, where do you want to go? What's your dreams? And then he kind of followed up a little bit later to see where they were at and whatnot. So there were some of those things. But I do think with like writings and people's memoirs, you're getting a lot of that. There's a really good, it's a self-published book from Seattle called Omoide, and that means memories. And I think that there's like 7 editions, but it's a group writing class where people would try to process, you know, their experiences, and they'll write it down and then they'll print them. So there's a lot of that out there.
All right, we'll have a little bit of time for conversation one-on-one, and we'll keep the exhibit open for a little bit longer. Hanako, Wakatsuki-Chong, thank you very much.